Yeah, you read that title right. We're gonna try and do this. This is gonna take forever. The Marlins are really defined as a franchise by their trades. They're one of the few teams ever to disband a championship-winning roster pretty much immediately after hoisting the trophy, and they did that twice. Numerous Hall of Fame players have donned the teal and black jersey, like Pudge Rodriguez, Mike Piazza, Trevor Hoffman, Miguel Cabrera, and the list goes on, but none of them have worn that uniform for very long, and there's a reason for that. From ownership changes to midseason firings to MVP and Cy Young winners sent out of town by the next year, the core that connects all of these Marlins stories is the art of the trade. And today, we're going to comb through every major trade in Marlins history, a list of nearly 40 trades that I've compiled. By the end, our brains will surely be mashed potatoes, but perhaps we'll be able to answer the question of whether or not all these transactions were worth it, and how many of these infamous swaps could have been avoided had the right people been in charge. Oh God, here we go. The inaugural Marlins team was not a very talented roster back in 1993, as is the status quo for any team during their first season in the league. That team lost 98 games, and they were above 500 for only the first day of the season and then never again. That all being said, the expansion draft didn't exactly go poorly for the Marlins. The selections they made from unprotected players on rosters across the league featured many all-stars like Carl Everett, and of course, the man who would become Mr. Marlin himself, Jeff Conine. But their most important selection was a man who only pitched 28 games in their teal uniform, future Hall of Fame closer Trevor Hoffman. Now, I know, trading away a future Cooperstown alumni could have been a catastrophic move to kick off the existence of a chaotic new franchise, but it definitely helps when said move brings in a guy who probably should be in the Hall of Fame as well. In June of 1993, with the team already 18 games back of the division lead, first-time general manager Dave Dombrowski swung a deal that would change the trajectory of this Florida franchise. In a five-player swap, the Florida Marlins acquired and extended their third baseman of the future, Gary Sheffield, who they quickly converted to left field when they saw him play third base. In return, Trevor Hoffman headed to Southern California, where he'd become a legend in a Padres uniform, locking down over 600 saves in his career. In terms of the WAR exchange in this trade, which I'm going to be doing for every trade to evaluate a winner and loser, the winner in this case would I guess be the San Diego Padres, but at the time, the Marlins desperately needed a cornerstone bat, so I don't consider this a bad trade. Gary Sheffield had many pit stops in his career, being that he was traded 5 separate times over the course of 22 years in the league, but his first meaningful era of play came in Florida. His .426 on-base percentage and .970 OPS in over 500 games still leads the franchise all-time. Just a month later, Dombrowski made another impactful move by replacing that closer void, quietly acquiring Rob Nen. After transitioning from a starter role to a reliever role, Nen found his footing in MLB and remains the most impressive closer in Marlins history, locking down over 100 saves over the course of 5 seasons with the Fish, the highest total in franchise history. Though the trades would slow down for the foreseeable future from here, Dombrowski continued to make impactful moves in building his roster, bringing in veteran manager Jim Leyland in 1997. International amateurs that he signed finally reached the roster and made an impact, like the middle infield tandem of Edgar Renteria and Luis Castillo, as well as starting pitcher Livan Hernandez. Key free agent signings in the outfield powered the lineup, most notably Moises Alou and Bobby Bonilla, and Dombrowski was able to fill out his rotation in the same market, inking Kevin Brown and Al Leiter to contracts to lead the starting pitching. The 1997 Marlins were built to contend, and they sure spent like it. Their payroll was the 7th highest in the majors at over $47 million. Really hold on to that note, because that's not going to be a common theme for pretty much the rest of this video.
You could be the honorary Marlin on opening day.
We want you to hit the Grand Slam prize.
Win a press season tickets and join in pregame activities.
Wear and keep your own Marlins uniform. Be a part of baseball history.
After never achieving a winning record, the 1997 Marlins not only got over 500, but won the National League wildcard spot by winning 92 games, which still stands as the franchise record for most wins in a single season. That year became the culmination of Dombrowski's efforts over a 5-year stretch, with the roster that he had fingerprints all over finally ascending to new heights. Every postseason game that Rob Nen pitched in, the Marlins won. Gary Sheffield hit a trio of home runs and had an OPS over 1,000 in 16 playoff games. Livan Hernandez turned the NLCS and Florida Florida's favor with a 15 strikeout performance. And don't look at any of these called strikes. These are all legit. He earned these. Nothing wrong with these calls. No way. Al Leiter tossed a quality start in Game 7 of the Fall Classic, a contest sealed with a walk-off hit by Edgar Renteria. The whole thing oozed in probability. Dombrowski had constructed a titan, but this force of nature had an unfortunate expiration date. In an ownership-mandated decision, the young general manager was forced to tear down the roster that he had just built to reach the mountaintop of the sport. Then owner Wayne Huizenga, who was a co-owner of Blockbuster, the Miami Dolphins, the Florida Panthers, this guy was pretty well off. He made a lot of money. He claimed that despite winning the World Series, the club lost $34 million in revenue, and he was determined to slash payroll and then subsequently sell the team. The legitimacy of this claim is still questioned to this day, and the goals of the team shifted from winning to gaining that number back by shedding payroll. In a swift and destructive offseason that kicked off the day after the World Series ended, the Marlins front office shipped out 9 players from their World Series winning roster, a combination of talent that accrued 68.3 wins above replacement during their time with the team. Dombrowski maintains that, to this day, he never thought of the 1998 Marlins as a defending world champion club, and it's pretty fair to see why. Before this offseason, the Marlins were known as the baby champs. Moving forward, the only thing they'd ever truly be recognized for is their roster fire sales, and this was the first of many. Hey there, it's me. I want to take a brief break from the chaotic nature of the Marlins to thank today's sponsor, which is DraftKings. Right now, you can use my promo code OLIVE. You can bet $5 on any wager and win $150 in bonus bets. Now, the Marlins are having a tough season, so I wouldn't recommend betting on them, but you do whatever you want with your bonus bet money. But DraftKings is a really fun way to get more skin in the game, get more investment in the game. Thank you to them for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to this long discussion on the Florida Marlins. The first of the trades wasn't all that bad for the Marlins, though. They sent their ace, Kevin Brown, to a familiar trade partner in the San Diego Padres in exchange for a prospect package. Brown, who was due to hit free agency after the 1998 season, almost single-handedly led the Padres to the playoffs and World Series with a Herculean performance, pitching just under 300 innings between the regular season and playoffs in what would become the best year of his career. He parlayed this year into the first ever $100 million contract in MLB history with the Los Angeles Dodgers. In return, the Marlins received their first baseman of the future in Derek Lee. He hung around the team from 1998 to 2003, and after finding his footing in his third season, he collected 4 straight 20-homer campaigns while playing Gold Glove caliber first base defense. His 129 home runs ranks 6th all-time in Marlins history. And they would need that offense in their lineup because they're trading away basically their entire lineup besides Luis Castillo. Prior to 1998 kicking off, the Marlins traded their number 2 starting pitcher as well, sending Al Leiter to the New York Mets. Leiter became one of the most accomplished pitchers in Mets history after signing a contract extension, tossing over 1,300 innings and helping his team make the NLCS and World Series in back-to-back seasons with stellar performances in the playoffs. In the prospect package they received, the marquee piece was another starting pitcher in AJ Burnett, a former 8th-round pick who joined the club by next season. He'd become a mainstay in the rotation from 1999 to 2005, tossing over 800 innings with a 1.11 ERA+. So far, so good on both fronts of these trades. But 1998 was about to be a rude awakening. Similar to their very first season, the club sat above 500 after the first game of the season and then never again. They promptly lost 11 games in a row, which became the record for most consecutive losses by a reigning World Series champion. By mid-May, the club was a dismal 14-30, already 15 games back of the division lead, heading down a road to becoming the first and only team to win a World Series and then lose over 100 games in the very next season. And thus, the fire sale was set to continue its course with its most explosive transaction yet. With Jeff Conine and Moises Alou already out the door from the offseason, the Florida Marlins continued to strip the offense down to its absolute bare bones. In a massive 7-player swap with the Dodgers, the Marlins traded their starting catcher, Charles Johnson, who had won 4 Gold Gloves in 4 seasons with the Fish. They also traded their starting third baseman, Bobby Bonilla, who managed a 124 OPS plus in over 180 games.
I've traveled so much recently, I have to read a scorecard to remember what team I'm on. Reading is a serious matter. If you can't read, you can't get ahead in life. If you're having trouble with your reading, ask about getting a tutor. You can't succeed in life without reading.
Fox, Saturday Baseball.
They traded both of their corner outfielders, Jim Eisenreich, and more notably, Gary Sheffield, the most accomplished position player in their brief history. In the blink of an eye, the lineup became completely unrecognizable, as Florida shed themselves of all of their upcoming free agents in just the second month of the season. The 7 players combined for $109.3 million in total salaries, $83 million of which was assumed by the Los Angeles Dodgers as the Marlins continued to slash money off payroll. With this, the fire sale of 1997 came to a close. The Marlins were able to bring in Derek Lee and AJ Burnett, who combined for over 20 WAR during their time in Florida. But as for the other 17 players acquired through these swaps, they all combined for 0 WAR on the dot exactly. To say that the Marlins' trajectory was flatlining would be pretty precise. However, their return from the Dodgers in the aforementioned trade would be significant. Coming to the Marlins was a future Hall of Fame catcher, Mike Piazza. He was coming off 5 straight Silver Sluggers at catcher and 2 straight MVP runner-up seasons, and was due for his own massive payday at the end of the 1998 season. And after just 5 games with the Marlins, he too was traded. After a week-long stint in Florida, the New York Mets came calling, who had just acquired Al Leiter from the Marlins, and they also worked a deal to bring in Mike Piazza as well. By the end of 1998, Piazza got his big-time contract, a 7-year extension worth $91 million to remain in New York for most of the rest of his career, and the rest is history. The iconic 9/11 home run, the heroics of the 2000 playoffs, over 200 bombs in the blue and orange. The Marlins could have had all of this had they ponied up the money to keep around the slew of talented players that continued to roll through their organization. Instead, it was yet another prospect package to tap into. The most notable player acquired here was Preston Wilson, who spent 4 years with the team playing outfield. He hit 104 home runs, which ranks 10th in Marlins history, but believe it or not, the largest prize here was the pitcher who never threw a single pitch for the team, Ed Yarnall. After the dismal 1998 season finally came to its conclusion, Dave Dombrowski's front office got back to work rebuilding their roster. Prior to 1999, the Marlins flipped Ed Yarnall, the pitcher I mentioned before. They combined him with a pair of minor leaguers for a prized prospect in the Yankees farm system, third baseman Mike Lowell. Baseball America ranked Mike Lowell the number 58 prospect in MLB and the Yankees' number 4 prospect overall. The Yankees were comfortable making this deal knowing that Scott Brosius would be manning the hot corner for the next 4 years after a trade with the Oakland A's and a subsequent extension worth $15 million. But the thing is, Mike Lowell became quite the player for the Marlins over the next few seasons. He'd spend the next 7 seasons in Florida, leading the charge on the next evolution of the roster through the end of the 90s through the early 2000s. He compiled 143 home runs and an 801 OPS in nearly 1,000 games with the club. While Mike Lowell, Preston Wilson, and Derek Lee became the new identity of the offense, the pitching struggled annually. And it didn't help that the Marlins accidentally let a generational pitcher slip through their fingertips. They had the top selection in the 1999 Rule 5 draft, a system that allows teams to poach players from other teams who are not currently rostered in the big leagues with the promise that that said player will remain on that team's MLB roster for the duration of the season. With that selection, they nabbed a future 2-time Cy Young winner in Johan Santana from the Houston Astros. But then, the very same day, they traded him again. They would receive a different pitching prospect by the name of Jared Kemp, who never made the big leagues. Who knows how much sooner their luck would have turned had they kept Johan around and developed him. Fortunately for them, a young stud pitching prospect was ready to rise through the ranks and achieve stardom for the team, all from yet another trade. The following transaction wouldn't be orchestrated by Dave Dombrowski, though, who departed for the Detroit Tigers following the 2001 season and took them from the worst team in the league to a World Series appearance in just 3 years' time. In 2002, Larry Beinfest was hired, and in 5 years' time, he'd be promoted to President of Baseball Operations in the Marlins organization. A big reason for that was the series of trades he devised soon after getting the gig, the first one being a swap for another prize prospect. The Marlins dealt from their weak pitching staff, sending away their closer Antonio Alfonseca and one of their rotation mates in Matt Clement to the Chicago Cubs. Those 2 pitchers would help the North Side return to winning baseball by next season, where they'd reach the championship series. We'll get to who they faced in just a little bit. Much of the return package didn't pan out for Florida, except for one young, promising hurler by the name of Dontrell Willis.
I think when I was younger, I just wanted to come up with a style of my own. The only thing I come with was the leg kick. It becomes a part of you. See, kids, this is key. Everyone got their mean faces? All right, now, Steph, and then kick your leg up real high.
By the end of 2002, he had climbed to number 43 on the top 100 prospects list, number 4 in Florida's system, alongside some names you're probably familiar with, including Josh Beckett, Miguel Cabrera, and Adrian Gonzalez. In the blink of an eye, the Marlins were about to be lifted from baseball purgatory back to the air of relevance. A big contributor to that was the final selling trades they made during the 2002 trade deadline. Prior to that 2002 deadline, the Marlins actually sat 3 games over 500 on July 6th and could have potentially stood pat and tried to compete. Instead, an 8-game losing skid derailed the hope and changed the team into sellers, and in all honesty, this losing streak right before the deadline is actually the best thing that could have happened to the franchise in their near decade of existence to this point. In response to the losing, the team flipped more veterans on expiring contracts, including longtime outfielder Cliff Floyd and homegrown starting pitcher Ryan Dempster. The most notable pieces brought in included starting pitcher Carl Pavano from the Expos, as well as Juan Encarnacion from the Reds, who would effectively replace those players at a cheaper value with more years of control. The 2002 team ended the season with 79 wins, but plenty of forward progress. During the process of the roster overhaul, ownership changed hands yet again. After just 3 years, John W. Henry sold the team just like his predecessor in his own pursuit to purchase and own the Boston Red Sox. 20 years later, they currently find themselves embroiled in their own ownership difficulties, so perhaps the Marlins dodged a bullet here. Oh wait, no, there's another Jeffrey Loria-sized bullet coming right at them. Yes, the Marlins would land in the hands of Jeffrey Loria, who had just organized the notorious sale of the Montreal Expos. While the circumstances were insidious, Loria was about to do something that not many other owners can say they've ever done in just his first season. In the 2002 offseason, the Marlins executed the swap of Preston Wilson and Juan Pierre, once again trading their starting catcher Charles Johnson in the process. They also brought in starting pitcher Mike Hampton, but flipped him rather quickly. The 2003 Marlins roster featured tons of young talent. Juan Pierre stole 65 bases out of the everyday leadoff spot, playing all 162 games. The corner infield tandem of Mike Lowell and Derek Lee both clubbed over 30 home runs. After A.J. Burnett went down with a season-ending surgery, Marlins fans got their first taste of Dontrelle Willis, who was called straight up from Double-A to join the rotation. Himself, Carl Pavano, and young pitching prospect Josh Beckett all pitched over 140 innings with great results. Miguel Cabrera also got the call mid-season and electrified fans with a great performance as a 20-year-old. But for me, the tying knot in this 2003 roster putting everything together was a key free agent signing. Prior to the season, the Marlins were able to swoop in and sign Ivan Rodriguez, more commonly known as Pudge Rodriguez, to a 1-year, $10 million deal to become the everyday catcher. This was significant considering that the team had just traded away Charles Johnson again, but also provided a much-needed veteran leader with proven success to guide one of the youngest rosters in baseball to prominence. New owner Jeffrey Loria deemed the signing a no-brainer, and it's hard to disagree with him. But there were certainly growing pains for this youthful squad who stumbled out of the gate to a 16-22 record and made a somewhat controversial decision to fire their second-year manager Jeff Toborg. In his place was Jack McKeon, a veteran manager with a dozen years of prior experience but no postseason berths on his managerial resume. McKeon's hiring was a massive change of pace. Many players were disappointed by Toborg's departure, but McKeon made the new situation apparent immediately upon his arrival. He explained to his players that he didn't need this job and that he was only there to help them. With a new air of accountability and professionalism, McKeon had begun an evolution of this Marlins roster. By the end of June, he had the exciting team back at 500, thanks in part to an effective nudist streak by backup catcher Todd Redmond. Times were different, guys, okay? Their winning ways in July had them in rare position to buy rather than sell at that trade deadline, and they took advantage. In what can be considered a pretty controversial move, the Florida Marlins traded their former number 1 overall draft pick from the 2000 draft, first baseman Adrian Gonzalez, who had suffered a wrist injury that the team believed would become a long-term issue. Suffice to say, considering his career, they were definitely wrong about that, but from the package that also included 2 other prospects, the team was able to bring in a new closer for the bullpen in Uguet Urbina. Though his Marlins tenure would only last through the end of the season before hitting free agency, Urbina's role in the Florida bullpen became integral to their success, locking down 10 saves between the regular season and playoffs, and racking up 2.1 WAR in that short time. Thus, the 2003 Marlins roster was complete. The young, scrappy underdog team was able to claw their way back to the playoffs for the first time since 1997. The Marlins faced a behemoth of a challenge in their first playoff matchup, taking on the Barry Bonds-led San Francisco Giants. But thanks to some clutch pitching and timely hitting, the Marlins rattled off 3 consecutive victories in the NLDS after dropping Game 1 to knock off the Goliath to their debut. David. Their key offseason signing, Pudge Rodriguez, came up with a walk-off 2-run single in Game 3, then held onto the ball on a collision play at home plate in Game 4 to preserve the lead in the last moment of the game. This set up a date with none other than the Chicago Cubs in the NLCS, the same team that had just traded Dontrelle Willis to the Marlins. The Marlins would prevail over the Cubs in a 7-game gauntlet of a series. At one point, the Cubs led the series 3-1. Josh Beckett threw a complete game shutout in Game 5 to send the series back to Chicago, where the Cubs would watch their 3-0 lead in the 8th inning of Game 6 vanish with one of the most improbable rallies in MLB postseason history. An 8-run barrage thanks to errors on and off the field to force a decisive Game 7. The momentum of that game carried over into the next, where the Marlins clinched their second World Series berth in franchise history thanks to 9 runs of offense and a clutch relief outing on short rest from Josh Beckett. Even the Dynasty-era New York Yankees couldn't get in the way of what seemed like a team of destiny. Though they fell down 2-1 in the series, a majestic pair of home runs from Miguel Cabrera and Alex Gonzalez won them Game 4 at home, before Brad Penny and Josh Beckett spun gems out of the rotation in each of the next 2 games to enable a series victory for the Marlins. Through all of their ownership controversy, manager firings, roster turnover, shedding of millions of dollars from their payroll, and basically no ballpark to call their own home stadium, they had somehow climbed the mountaintop again. And yet, somehow, the Florida Marlins' second World Series victory would take them down the same ominous path that their first did. While the Marlins were able to work out a 4-year contract extension to keep Mike Lowell on the team, they failed to secure the other half of their corner infield tandem. In a shocking cost-cutting move shortly after the World Series, the Marlins traded their first baseman Derek Lee to the very team he helped them conquer in the NLCS, the Chicago Cubs. The package they received was highlighted by Hee-Seop Choi, who lasted just half the season in Florida before getting traded again. Meanwhile, Derek Lee would play the next 7 seasons in Chicago, accruing over 20 WAR in a very lopsided trade. Despite the departure of closer Uguet Urbina and catcher Pudge Rodriguez, the 2004 Marlins retooled and looked to compete again. They brought in Armando Benitez to be the closer on a free agent contract and would get a full healthy season out of AJ Burnett, who made just 4 starts the year prior. Though they maintained a winning record throughout the first half of the season, just a game back of first place on the first day of July, the team headed into that year's deadline looking to retool again. It turns out that it would be a lot more difficult to replace Derek Lee's production than they initially expected, and the team quickly pivoted away from the previously acquired Hee-Seop Choi in another multiplayer swap with the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Marlins sent Choi and longtime starter Brad Penny across the country to the West Coast in exchange for a reunion with Juan Encarnacion, as well as a big get for their catching woes, all-star catcher Paul LaDuca, who had just a year and a half left before entering free agency. He would go on to play over 200 games for the Marlins. The reshaped Marlins offense caught fire at the end of August and helped the team win 9 straight games to climb 10 games over 500 in early September. Though the division looked to belong to Atlanta once again, the Fish were just a game and a half back of the National League wildcard spot, but they'd win just 11 of their next 28 games to tumble back into mediocrity, finishing with a winning record of 83-79, but no postseason berth to show for it. With expiring contracts looming ahead for many of their key players like Josh Beckett, Juan Pierre, and AJ Burnett, 2005 became a very important season, potentially their last season in this window to truly compete in. In the offseason, the team made a far bigger splash by fixing their first baseman problem, signing Carlos Delgado to a 4-year deal worth $52 million. Delgado is one of the most underrated sluggers in the history of the sport. He had played a dozen years all for one team in the Toronto Blue Jays up to that point and clubbed 336 home runs while he was at it. He instantly transformed the identity of the Marlins offense. But with more pitchers like Armando Benitez and Carl Pavano departing in free agency, the acquisition of Carlos Delgado would only be able to balance out that loss. In July, the 05 team once again found themselves hovering around that same 500 record, though this time the team stood pat, believing their roster needed no retooling. They had opportunities to trade Burnett, Beckett, and Pierre, but kept them this time around. At first, that belief was rewarded, with the Marlins winning 17 games in August to climb to a record of 7 games over 500 at the beginning of September. In a weaker National League, the Marlins still stood a shot at the wildcard spot once again, just a game and a half out, with a month to go for the second straight year. They actually gained sole possession of that wildcard playoff spot 2 weeks later, sitting 11 games over 500, but in a crushing turn of events, the team stumbled into a devastating September collapse, losing 12 of their next 14 games to effectively seal their own fate. They again finished with an 83-79 record and no playoff berth to show for it. Only this time, the clock had expired on their roster, and the Florida Marlins simply didn't have the payroll to keep the core intact, allegedly. Just like they had done 7 years prior, the Marlins were set to blow up their successful roster in one of the most explosive fire sales of talent in the history of MLB. The trust of Florida fans everywhere had been compromised and betrayed once again, and this time there'd be no World Series miracle on the near horizon. The Marlins were entering a 2-decade period of baseball purgatory that no amount of homegrown or acquired talent could help them crawl out of. And that is the end of part 1 of the insane trade history of the Florida Marlins. Now, there's a lot more to go, so make sure you tune in next Saturday for part 2, and if you guys enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like on it and subscribing to the Jolly Olive channel. I appreciate it. I'll see you guys next time.